I remember the moment of my first death, though the apothecaries tell me it wasn't truly death at all. They use words like catastrophic trauma and biological cessation averted, but I know what I felt. The orc warboss's power claw had torn through my ceramite plating like parchment, shredded the fused ribcage beneath, and crushed organs that had been gene-forged to withstand punishment that would liquefy a baseline human. I remember the taste of blood filling my throat, thick and copper-bright, remember the way my secondary heart stuttered and failed when the primary was reduced to pulp. I remember looking up at the green Martian sky of that nameless world, watching it fade to grey, then black, and thinking with perfect clarity, this is how brothers die. This is the Emperor's peace. But the Emperor, it seems, was not done with me. They found me in the aftermath, when the greenskin horde had been purged and the world rendered compliant once more. My squad brothers had fought on without me, as was proper, as our training demanded. Victory mattered more than any individual life. By the time the apothecaries reached my position, I had been technically dead for 17 minutes. My gene seed had already been extracted, that most precious resource that would create the next generation of the chapter's warriors. In any reasonable assessment, I was finished, a body to be rendered down for nutrients, armor to be reclaimed and re-sanctified, another name to be inscribed in the Chapel of Remembrance. The Tech Marines thought differently. I learned later that they had been searching for a candidate. The chapter's complement of dreadnoughts had been depleted in the previous campaign, 2 of the ancient ones finally succumbing to damage even their armored sarcophagi could not withstand. The forge shrines stood empty, their machine spirits restless without a pilot to bond with, without a warrior's consciousness to direct their terrible strength. When the Tech Marines examined my body, they found something that made them pause. My brain, somehow, had remained largely intact. The redundant neurological structures of my enhanced physiology had protected the core of who I was, even as everything else failed. The membrane that encased my brain had held. The synaptic pathways remained viable. I could be saved. Or rather, what remained of me could be preserved. The first sensation I remember after the darkness was not sight or sound but pressure. Immense, unbearable pressure surrounding my entire body, as if I had been compressed into a space far too small to contain me. I tried to scream, tried to activate my Vox bead to call for my squad, tried to move arms that would not respond. Panic flooded through me, pure animal panic that our hypno-conditioning was supposed to have burned away decades ago during my transformation from aspirant to full battle brother. I thrashed against invisible restraints, and distantly, as if from very far away, I heard alarms begin to sound. Voices filtered through the haze, the measured, emotionless tones of a Tech Marine speaking in the ritual cant of the Omnissiah, the lower, more urgent voice of an apothecary, reading vital signs that made no sense to my fragmenting consciousness. Then a third voice, one I recognized even through the chaos in my mind, my chapter master, speaking my name, my actual name, the one I had carried before taking the oaths, before receiving the gene seed, before becoming one of the Emperor's angels of death. A name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in a century. He told me to be calm. He told me that I had been honored beyond measure. He told me that I would continue to serve, that my war was not over, that the Emperor still had need of my strength. His words were meant to be reassuring, to anchor me to purpose and duty, as they had done countless times before. But there was something in his tone, a hesitation, perhaps, or a heaviness that spoke of things he was not saying, things I would discover soon enough. The pressure began to ease, and with it came new sensations. Cold, first, a cold so profound it seemed to seep into my very thoughts, slowing them, making each one a laborious effort. Then liquid, thick and viscous, surrounding me completely. I couldn't breathe, or rather, I was breathing, but not with lungs. Oxygen was being delivered directly into my bloodstream through tubes I could not see, but could feel as foreign intrusions throughout what remained of my body. I tried again to move, and this time felt something respond, not my arms or legs, but something vast and ponderous, accompanied by the grinding whir of servo motors and the hiss of hydraulic pistons. They had entombed me. That was the word they used later, when the chaplain came to speak the rites of my second awakening. Entombed, sealed within a sarcophagus of reinforced ceramite and adamantium, suspended in amniotic gel, connected by thousands of neural interfaces to the walking shrine that would serve as my new body. I had become a dreadnought, one of the chapter's most revered and terrible warriors. I was honored, they said. Blessed, they said. I would fight on for centuries, perhaps millennia, long after my brothers had fallen and been forgotten. My experience would guide future generations. My fury would break the enemies of mankind upon worlds I could not yet imagine. But as I hung in that darkness, feeling the chemical cocktail that kept me docile beginning to wear thin, all I could think about was the fact that I would never again feel the sun on my face, never again know the simple pleasure of eating solid food, of tasting water, of breathing air unfiltered through scrubbers and chemical processes. Never again stand among my brothers as one of them, sharing in their camaraderie, their quiet moments of fellowship between battles. I had been saved, yes. But what, precisely, had they saved? The integration process took weeks, though time became difficult to track within the sarcophagus. My circadian rhythms, usually so carefully regulated by my enhanced physiology, meant nothing in the unchanging darkness of my tomb. I slept when the tech marines sedated me, woke when they needed me conscious for testing and calibration. Gradually, painstakingly, they taught my brain to interpret the data streams flowing from the Dreadnought sensors. At first it was overwhelming, a cacophony of information that had no analog in human experience. Temperature readings from a dozen different systems, pressure sensors in the hydraulic lines, power fluctuations in the plasma reactor that served as my heart, targeting data from weapons I could not yet comprehend controlling. But we had been trained for adaptation. The transformation from baseline human to Adeptus Astartes involved rewiring the brain in fundamental ways, teaching it to process information from secondary organs and enhanced senses that no normal human possessed. This was another transformation, another evolution into something greater and more terrible than what had come before. The tech marines were patient, methodical. They would activate one system at a time, let me learn to interpret its feedback, then add another layer of complexity. Vision came first, the stark, grainy feed from the optical sensors mounted in the Dreadnought's head. It was nothing like natural sight. Colors were muted, depth perception required conscious calculation, but I learned to see. Then came hearing, and with it, the constant background noise that would be my companion forever after. The thrumming of the reactor, steady as a heartbeat, but somehow wrong, slightly too fast or too slow depending on power demands. The whisper of lubricant flowing through joints, the creak of metal expanding and contracting with temperature changes, the eternal electronic hum of the cogitator systems that mediated between my biological brain and the machine that housed it. There was never silence. Even when I was powered down, held in the half-death of hibernation between campaigns, I could hear the systems maintaining my body, keeping the thin thread of my life from finally snapping. They tested my weapons on the firing range, and I learned what it meant to kill with tools that dwarfed anything I had carried as a battle brother. My right arm mounted a twin-linked las cannon, capable of punching through the armor of enemy vehicles with beams of coherent light that turned steel to vapor. The recoil, transmitted through the arm's structure into the central chassis, felt like being struck by a battering ram. My left arm bore a massive power fist, sheathed in a crackling disruption field that could tear apart bunkers and crush battle tanks like tin cans. When I struck the test target's reinforced ceramite blocks as tall as a man, they exploded into fragments, and I felt the impact resonate through my entire frame like an earthquake contained in metal bones. The tech marines expressed satisfaction with my progress. The Dreadnought's machine spirit had accepted me, they said, had recognized me as worthy to direct its wrath. The bonding was proceeding ahead of schedule. Soon I would be ready for combat trials, then deployment with the chapter once more. They spoke with pride, as if describing the successful forging of a particularly fine weapon, which, I suppose, is exactly what I had become. My first battle came 3 months after my awakening. The enemy was a splinter of a Xenos hive fleet, and the world we fought on was an agri-world, whose name I no longer remember. The details have blurred together with dozens of similar engagements, but I remember the sensation of deployment. The drop pod specially reinforced and enlarged to accommodate my Dreadnought chassis screaming through the atmosphere, surrounded by the pods carrying my battle brothers to war. I was locked into restraint clamps, designed to withstand forces that would crush unaugmented humans to paste, and even through the layers of armor and my sarcophagus, I could feel the vibration of atmospheric entry rattling through my frame. The landing was violent. Even with retro thrusters firing at maximum, the impact drove me down against the restraints with crushing force. Then the clamps released, the frontal assault ramp exploded outward in a shower of sparks, and I was walking, striding, stomping forward into the alien dawn. My visual sensors adjusted automatically to the harsh light, and tactical overlays painted friend or foe markers across my field of vision. My squad brothers, those who had once been my peers, now looked impossibly small and fragile as they fanned out around me. I stood 3 times their height, massed as much as a light vehicle, and when I moved, the ground shook. The enemy came at us in a chittering tide of claws and teeth and bioweaponry. I opened fire with the lascannon, sweeping the beam across their front ranks, and watched Xenos bodies come apart in bursts of flash-cooked flesh and superheated chitin. The power fist crushed everything that came within reach. I grabbed a warrior beast the size of a small tank, and squeezed, feeling its carapace splinter and collapse, feeling its death throes transmitted through the haptic feedback of the arm's sensors. My brother's bolter fire cracked around me, but I barely registered it over the roar of my own weapons, the bellowing war cry that the Dreadnought's external vox speakers amplified to a volume that could shatter stone. We won, of course. We always won, or nearly always, and in the immediate aftermath, riding high on the chemicals the Dreadnought systems pumped into my bloodstream to keep me alert and aggressive during combat, I felt something approaching satisfaction. I had served. I had crushed the Emperor's enemies. I had proven that even death could not stop me from doing my duty. My brothers gathered around me, their respect palpable even through the cold barrier of my senses. I was a hero, an exemplar, a walking reliquary of the chapter's martial prowess, but then the battle stims faded, as they always did, and the loneliness came crashing back. My brothers could remove their helmets, could breathe the planet's air, could tend to their wounds and eat, and speak to one another with voices that carried warmth and humanity. I remained sealed in my tomb, dependent on the tech marines to maintain the hundreds of systems keeping me alive, unable to touch or taste or feel anything, except through layers of metal and sensors that reduced all sensation to data streams and electrical impulses. I tried to join in the post-battle rituals, tried to speak with my old friends, but my voice emerged from the vox speakers as a mechanical thunder that bore little resemblance to the voice I remembered having. They looked up at me, up, always up now, and I could see the mixture of reverence and discomfort in their eyes. I was no longer one of them. I was something other, something sacred and terrible and separate. The decades that followed established the pattern that would define my existence. Battle, hibernation, repair, and battle again. The chapter's tech marines became more familiar to me than my squad brothers had ever been. They knew every centimeter of my Dreadnought chassis, every quirk of its machine spirit, every weak point in the armor that needed reinforcement. They performed the sacred rites of maintenance with a thoroughness that bordered on obsessive, because they knew that any failure, any overlooked flaw, could mean not just the loss of a valuable war machine, but the final death of the warrior sealed within it. I learned to dread the repair bays almost as much as I had once dreaded battle. The process of opening the sarcophagus for maintenance was agonizing in ways I still struggle to articulate. They would drain the amniotic fluid, exposing what remained of my body to air for the first time since my entombment. The temperature differential alone was excruciating, from the carefully regulated warmth of the suspension medium to the cold sterility of the forge's atmosphere. But worse was the sensation of disconnection as they detached the neural interfaces for inspection and replacement. Suddenly I was blind, deaf, unable to feel anything beyond the dull throb of my biological body. I existed in a sensory void, aware only of my breathing and the labored beating of my hearts, until the tech marine finished his work and restored my connections to the Dreadnought systems. Sometimes they would leave me conscious during these procedures. They claimed it was necessary, that they needed my feedback to properly calibrate the interfaces, but I suspected there was another reason. The machine spirit, they said, grew restless when its pilot slept too long. It needed to feel my consciousness present, directing it, giving it purpose. So I remained awake, locked in the darkness of my own body, while they worked with sacred unguents and blessed oils and prayers to the Omnissiah. I would count the seconds, then the minutes, then lose track entirely as time stretched into an eternity of isolation. When they finally completed the rites and restored my systems, the flood of sensation, sight and sound, and the feeling of having a body again, even one made of ceramite and adamantium, was almost painful in its intensity. The worst part, though, was watching my brothers age and die while I remained unchanged, unchanging, unable to die. I saw battle brothers I had trained alongside fall to enemy fire, saw their gene seed extracted and their names added to the rolls of honored dead. I saw new recruits arrive, wide-eyed aspirants who became hardened warriors who eventually fell in battle or succumbed to wounds that even our enhanced physiology couldn't overcome. Generations of Space Marines passed through the chapter while I endured, locked in my walking tomb, my biological aging slowed to nearly nothing by the stasis field generators integrated into the sarcophagus. The chapter master who had spoken to me during my awakening fell in battle against an orc war. His successor lasted 60 years before a daemon's blade found the gap in his armor. The next died of old age, a rarity among our kind at over 400 years of service. I saw them all come and go, these men I had once called brother, who now regarded me with the same distant reverence they showed the chapter's most ancient relics. Because that's what I had become, a relic, a thing to be maintained and deployed and venerated, but not truly understood, not truly known as the person I had once been. They offered me hibernation between campaigns. The Tech Marines could put me into a deep sleep, they said, where centuries would pass like days, where I would only wake when the chapter needed my strength. Many dreadnoughts chose this path, preferring the dreamless dark of stasis to the endless awareness of being trapped in the machine. But I refused. Some stubborn part of me clung to consciousness, to the passage of time, to the feeling of still being alive rather than merely preserved. I wanted to know I was experiencing my existence, however limited and painful it had become, rather than skipping through it like a stone across water. That decision, I think now, may have been a mistake. The campaigns blurred together after the first century. I fought orcs on jungle worlds where the humidity corroded my actuators and required constant maintenance. I fought heretics on civilized worlds where entire cities burned at our passing. I fought the ancient enemy, the ruinous powers, daemons and corrupted marines, on worlds where reality itself bent and twisted around us. Each battle followed the same pattern. Deployment, carnage, victory or stalemate, extraction. The Tech Marines repaired the damage I sustained, replaced parts that had been destroyed, consecrated new weapons to my chassis when the old ones were beyond recovery. Slowly, piece by piece, the dreadnought that housed me changed. The original chassis had been ancient even when I was first entombed, a relic from the chapter's founding, but war is entropy given form, and entropy takes its toll. An arm destroyed by a power claw, replaced with a newer model that didn't quite interface perfectly with the old systems. The left leg assembly shattered by artillery fire, rebuilt with parts cannibalized from another dreadnought that had finally died. Armor plates replaced, sensors upgraded, the reactor overhauled twice, then 3 times. The Tech Marines kept meticulous records, documenting every change, but I lost track. How much of the original machine remained? How much of what walked into battle bearing my consciousness was still the dreadnought I had first awakened in? And more troubling, how much of me remained? My memories were intact, preserved in the biological brain that the sarcophagus protected so carefully. But my personality, my sense of self, had begun to fray at the edges. I found myself forgetting details of my life before entombment. The face of my first combat instructor, once crystal clear in my mind, became hazy. The names of squad brothers I had served with for decades escaped me. Time itself became strange, elastic. Sometimes days seemed to pass in minutes. Other times, a single hour of consciousness felt like it stretched on for years. The apothecaries assured me this was normal, expected even. The mind was not meant to endure for centuries, they said. Even our enhanced brains, gene-forged for resilience and longevity, had limits. The fact that I remained functional, remained sane, or at least sane by the standards of one entombed in a dreadnought, was testament to the strength of my will and the effectiveness of the sarcophagus's preservation systems. Some dreadnoughts lost themselves much earlier, their personalities dissolving into rage and madness, requiring sedation between battles lest they attack friend and foe alike. I held on to sanity by establishing rituals. Between campaigns, during the long stretches of time when I was confined to the forge shrines, I would have the tech marines position my dreadnought chassis facing the chapel. Through my optical sensors, I could see the stained glass windows, depicting the Emperor and the Primarchs, could watch the battle brothers at prayer, could listen to the chaplains delivering sermons about duty and sacrifice, and the eternal war against the darkness. I couldn't kneel, couldn't perform the physical genuflections that were part of our devotions, but I could focus my consciousness on the words, on the meaning behind them, and find something approaching peace. I also counted. Compulsively, obsessively, I counted everything. The number of battles I had fought, the enemies I had slain, the rounds I had fired, the tons of armor I had crushed, the names of the fallen I had avenged. The tech marines thought it was a quirk of my personality, reasserting itself through the trauma of entombment. The chaplains suggested it was a form of prayer, a way of making my war into a meditation on duty. I think it was simpler than that. I counted because counting gave me a sense of progression, of time moving forward rather than simply repeating endlessly. As long as the numbers increased, I knew I was still experiencing, still living in some fashion. The 4th century of my entombment brought changes. The chapter had sustained heavy losses in a protracted campaign against the forces of chaos, and our numbers were diminished. The dreadnought complement had dwindled as well. I was now the eldest, the most experienced, the one who had served longest in the walking tombs. They gave me new honors, new titles. I was designated ancient, a rank that came with both respect and additional responsibility. My counsel was sought on matters of tactics and strategy. When new dreadnoughts were awakened, I was the one who spoke to them in those first confused moments, who helped guide them through the horror of what they had become. I should have felt pride. Instead, I felt hollowed out, as if all the emotions that had once defined me had been slowly scraped away, leaving only duty and the echoing emptiness where a human heart had once beat with passion and fear and love and hate. I spoke the words the newly awakened needed to hear, told them they had been honored, that they would serve gloriously, that the Emperor himself smiled upon their sacrifice. But I could not feel the conviction those words demanded. I had become an actor, performing the role of the wise ancient warrior, because that was what the chapter needed, not because I believed in it anymore. The breaking point came during a campaign on a forge world that had fallen to corruption. The enemy had twisted the planet's manufactorums into blasphemous feigns, had bound daemons into the very machines that had once produced weapons for the Imperium. We fought through corridors of screaming metal, through workshops, where the souls of enslaved workers had been melded with industrial equipment to create hybrid abominations. The air was thick with the stench of spoiled lubricant and burning flesh, and the vox channels were polluted with electronic screaming that set my audio receptors howling. In the depths of the main forge complex, we encountered what the enemy had created as their ultimate weapon, a chaos dreadnought, if that term even applied to the thing that lurched out of the darkness to meet us. It had been a space marine once, probably a loyalist captured and corrupted, but it had been rebuilt with such utter disregard for the sanctity of the human form that it was barely recognizable as having ever been human at all. Where my sarcophagus maintained the illusion that a warrior resided within, providing life support and preservation, this thing's pilot was simply chained to the machine, fused with it, their body overtly integrated into the structure in ways that made my gorge rise. I could see organic components, lungs, intestines, things I couldn't identify wrapped around pistons and wired into power conduits. The pilot's head was mounted on a spike atop the chassis, still alive, still aware, their mouth open in a perpetual scream of agony and ecstasy. We fought. Power fist against chain fist, las cannon against inferno cannon, the fury of the Emperor against the madness of the warp. The battle was brutal, protracted, both of us trading blows that would have obliterated lesser war machines. My brothers tried to support me, but this was a fight between ancients, between walking tombs, and their weapons could do little against armor that was proof against most man-portable arms. I won. Eventually, my power fist crushed the Chaos Dreadnought's reactor housing, and the resulting explosion tore the corrupted machine apart. But in the moment before I struck the killing blow, I looked into the eyes of the thing's pilot, and I saw something there that chilled me more than any horror I had witnessed in 4 centuries of war. I saw recognition, and beneath that, I saw relief. They were glad I was ending it, glad I was giving them the death that their own side would never grant, the release from an existence that had become nothing but suffering and corruption and the endless whisper of daemons in their mind. In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity that there was no meaningful difference between what had been done to them and what had been done to me. Both of us had been sealed in machines. Both of us had been reduced to weapons, our humanity stripped away in service to powers beyond our comprehension. The only difference was that I told myself I served a righteous cause, that my sacrifice meant something, that the Emperor cared about the warrior trapped in the walking tomb. But standing in that corrupted forge, surrounded by the screaming of tortured machines and the smell of burning daemon flesh, I could no longer convince myself that any of it mattered. My cause was more righteous, yes. The Imperium, for all its cruelty and oppression, was fighting for humanity's survival against forces that would consume all life in the galaxy. But that didn't change what had been done to me, didn't change the fact that I was a prisoner in my own body, sentenced to an existence that was neither life nor death, forced to continue fighting long after any sane being would have been allowed to rest. The chaplain noticed the change in me after that battle. He came to speak with me in the forge shrine, stood before my dreadnought chassis with his skull-faced helmet held under one arm, and asked if I was troubled. I told him what I had felt, what I had realized. I expected anger, or perhaps disappointment. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Every ancient reaches this point," he said. His voice was gentle, understanding in a way that surprised me. "The moment when the weight of centuries becomes too much to bear, when you question whether your continued existence serves any purpose beyond the chapter's convenience. Some lose themselves to rage, becoming mad dogs that must be put down. Others retreat into hibernation and never truly wake again. But the strongest, the ones who endure, they find a new understanding." He told me that my purpose was not to feel joy or satisfaction in my service. Those were human emotions, and I was no longer fully human. I was something greater and more terrible, a weapon sanctified by suffering, a relic that existed to remind the chapter of the cost of war and the depths of sacrifice duty demanded. "My existence itself was a prayer," he said. "Every battle I fought was a sermon written in the blood of the Emperor's enemies. Every year I endured in my tomb was an offering to the eternal war effort." I wanted to believe him. I tried to believe him. But standing there, feeling the cold metal of my sarcophagus pressing in from all sides, feeling the weight of centuries bearing down on my consciousness, I could only think that he was offering me a narrative to make bearable what was ultimately unbearable, a story to justify an existence that should never have been extended this far beyond its natural end. But what choice did I have? I couldn't end it myself. The sarcophagus's life support systems were beyond my control, managed by the tech marines and their arcane machines. I couldn't refuse deployment. The machine spirit bonded to me would drive me into battle, whether I willed it or not. My consciousness dragged along like a prisoner shackled to a giant. I could perhaps provoke my own destruction by throwing myself into impossibly dangerous situations, but that would betray my brothers, would waste the resources the chapter had invested in me, would be the final and most complete surrender to despair. So I continued, because continuing was all I knew how to do, because duty, however hollow it had become, was the last thread connecting me to the warrior I had once been, because the alternative was madness, and I feared madness more than I feared the endless years ahead. The 5th century brought technological advancements that the tech marines applied to my chassis with enthusiasm. New reactor designs promised greater power output with less risk of critical failure. Enhanced targeting cogitators would improve my accuracy by significant percentages. Improved armor composites would better protect the sarcophagus at my core. Each upgrade required extensive surgery to the Dreadnought, and by extension, invasive procedures on my physical body as they rerouted neural connections and installed new interface hardware. I submitted to it all without complaint. What else could I do? But each procedure felt like another layer of separation between what I had been and what I was becoming. More of my consciousness dedicated to interpreting machine data and less to processing anything resembling human thought. More of my awareness occupied by tactical calculations and threat assessments, and the endless monitoring of system status, leaving less room for memories, for reflection, for anything that might be called an interior life. I began to lose time, not forget it, precisely, but lose consciousness of its passage. I would be engaged in battle, then suddenly find myself in the Forge Shrine with no clear memory of the transition. The tech marines assured me this was normal. The strain of combat and the centuries of service were taking their toll on my organic brain, and the Dreadnought's machine spirit was compensating, taking over more of the routine functions to spare my consciousness the burden. They spoke of it as a mercy, but it felt like drowning in slow motion, feeling my sense of self slowly subsumed by the machine even as my body was preserved in its perpetual half-life. The chapter's newest recruits had never known the Imperium without my presence. I had been ancient for longer than most of them had been alive. They spoke of me in reverent whispers, treated me like a figure from legend rather than a battle brother who happened to be sealed in a metal tomb. None of them knew my name anymore, the name I had carried before my transformation. They called me Ancient, or Venerable One, or by the designation the tech marines had assigned to my chassis, designation Primus 7. I tried once to tell a young initiate my name. We were in the chapel, and he had approached me with questions about a historical battle I had participated in 3 centuries prior. After I answered, I told him my name, the one I had been given at birth, before the trials, before the gene seed, before any of this. He looked confused, then uncomfortable. He thanked me for the tactical insight and hurried away. Later, I overheard him telling another initiate that the ancient's mind must be wandering, that I had started speaking in old dialects about things that made no sense. He was right, in a way. My name made no sense anymore. That person was gone, had been gone for 500 years. What remained was the ancient, the dreadnought, the weapon. Names were for people, and I was no longer entirely certain that I qualified. The rearmament became more frequent as the centuries accumulated. Each campaign seemed to introduce me to new horrors, new enemies with weapons specifically designed to defeat the very armor that kept me functional. Melter weapons that could reduce ceramite to slag. Graviton guns that could tear my chassis apart at the molecular level. Esoteric Xenos technology that I couldn't even begin to understand, but which left my dreadnought crippled and burning. After each engagement, the tech marines would assess the damage, perform the sacred rites of repair, and often determine that entire systems needed replacement. The process took weeks, sometimes months. They would disassemble portions of the chassis, install new components, spend days calibrating the machine spirit to accept the foreign elements, all while I remained conscious, locked in my sarcophagus, feeling every adjustment like a violation, every new part like a foreign growth that my body was being forced to accommodate. The worst was when they replaced my primary weapons. The lascannon I had carried for 300 years, that had become as familiar to me as my own hand had once been, was destroyed beyond repair by an Eldar bright lance. Its replacement was more powerful, more accurate, integrated with targeting systems that fed me more information than I knew what to do with. But it felt wrong. The weight was different, the recoil had a different character, and the machine spirit fragment that inhabited it was strange to me, requiring weeks of use before it began to respond to my will with anything approaching the smoothness I had known before. They replaced my power fist with a chain fist, after a campaign against tyrannid bio-horrors proved that I needed better close combat capabilities against armored targets. The chainfist was devastating, a massive, rotating blade, sheathed in a disruption field that could saw through bunker walls and tank armor with equal ease. But the sensation of using it was disturbing in ways I struggled to articulate. The lascannon was a directed energy weapon, clean and distant. The power fist had been brutal but quick. The chain fist was neither. I felt every second of contact as it tore through enemy armor, felt the vibration of the teeth grinding through metal and flesh, heard the screams amplified through the chassis' audio receptors. It was intimate in a way that made my preservation fluids run cold, but it was effective, and effectiveness was all that mattered now. I was no longer a warrior, with a warrior's concerns for honor and clean kills. I was a weapon, and weapons were judged solely on their capacity for destruction. The 6th century brought my first major system failure. I was engaged against orc forces on a death world, fighting through a jungle where the flora itself was carnivorous and hostile. My reactor had been running hot for hours, the heat sinks unable to properly dissipate the thermal load in the humid, dense atmosphere. I ignored the warning indicators, pushed forward to support my brothers as they assaulted an orc fortress. Then, mid-stride, the reactor safeguards engaged automatically, dropping my power output to minimal levels to prevent a catastrophic meltdown. I felt my dreadnought body lurch to a halt, felt the strength drain from my limbs as emergency power routing left only enough energy to maintain the sarcophagus's life support and basic systems. Through my optical sensors, I watched the battle continue around me, watched my brothers fighting and dying while I stood frozen, a statue on the battlefield. An orc nob saw my vulnerability and charged, bellowing its savage war cry. I tried to move, tried to bring my weapons to bear, but nothing responded. The targeting reticule in my vision tracked the orc's approach with perfect precision, calculated firing solutions that would have torn it apart, but my weapons remained silent and still. It struck me with a massive chopper, the crude blade biting deep into my chassis armor. I felt the impact through the sarcophagus, felt it rock me in my suspension fluid. Another blow, then another. Metal screamed and tore, warning klaxons blared in my audio receptors. Then, blessedly, one of my brothers managed to kill the orc with a well-placed crack grenade, and the immediate danger passed. But I remained frozen, helpless, until the tech marines could reach me and perform emergency repairs sufficient to get the reactor restarted. The whole incident lasted perhaps 10 minutes. It felt like hours. I had spent 6 centuries as a walking engine of destruction, secure in the knowledge that even though I was trapped in my tomb, I at least had power, had the ability to affect the battlefield, to fulfill my purpose. In those 10 minutes, I learned what true helplessness felt like. I was aware, conscious, able to see and hear everything happening around me, but completely unable to act. A prisoner not just in my sarcophagus but in a body that had become a cage within a cage. The tech marines assured me the safeguards had functioned as designed, that without them engaging, I would have suffered a reactor breach that would have killed me and everyone within 100 meters. They were right, of course. But that didn't change what I had learned about my situation. I was entirely dependent on machines that could fail, maintained by tech marines who could make mistakes, vulnerable to damage that could leave me aware, but paralyzed. The illusion of agency I had clung to, the belief that I still had some measure of control over my existence, had been revealed as just that, an illusion. I began to experience what the apothecaries called recursive deterioration of neural pathways. The biological brain, they explained, was not meant to process machine data for centuries without degradation. My neurons were being damaged by the constant flow of electrical signals from the neural interfaces, slowly dying and being replaced by scar tissue that conducted the signals less effectively. They could mitigate the damage with drugs and occasional surgical interventions, but they couldn't stop it entirely. Eventually, possibly within another century or two, my organic brain would no longer be capable of interfacing with the Dreadnought effectively. When that happened, they would have options. They could integrate more of the Dreadnought's machine spirit to handle functions my brain could no longer manage. They could install cogitator augmentation directly into my skull, replacing failing neurons with electronic equivalents. They could, if necessary, place me in permanent hibernation, waking me only for the most critical battles. Or, if the deterioration became too severe, if I lost the ability to distinguish friend from foe or control my weapons reliably, they would perform the final rites and let me die at last. I should have found that last option comforting. An end, finally, to an existence that had long since ceased to be anything resembling a life. But the thought of dying, of my consciousness finally winking out after so many centuries, filled me with a terror I couldn't quite explain. I had become afraid of death, even though death would be a mercy, even though every fiber of my being longed for the release it would bring. The decades had conditioned me to endure, to persist, to continue no matter the cost. The idea of that ending, of there being nothing beyond this endless present, was somehow more frightening than the prospect of continuing forever. I volunteered for the cogitator augmentation. The tech marines were surprised most ancients resisted such modifications, seeing them as a step too far, a final surrender of whatever humanity remained. But I reasoned that I had already surrendered my humanity centuries ago. This was just acknowledging the reality of what I had become. If machine components could help me continue to function, to serve, to maintain some semblance of purpose, then I would accept them. The procedure took place over several sessions, each one requiring them to partially wake me from sedation so they could test the integration. They drilled into my skull, installed processors and memory units, threaded wires through my brain tissue to create new pathways for information flow. I felt every moment of it, felt the foreign matter being inserted into my head, felt my thoughts becoming sharper and faster and less human with each new component they activated. When it was complete, I could process the Dreadnought's data streams with perfect clarity. Targeting calculations that had once required conscious effort now happened instantaneously, below the level of awareness. System diagnostics ran continuously in the background of my consciousness, alerting me to potential issues before they became critical. I could track a dozen different tactical variables simultaneously, could integrate battle data from my brother's armor sensors and the chapter's orbital assets, could fight with an efficiency that would have been impossible with my purely biological brain. But I could no longer remember the smell of rain. I tried one day, during a rare moment of peace, to recall that simple sensation, the smell of water falling on dry earth, something I had experienced countless times in my life before the sarcophagus. The memory was gone, not faded or hazy, but completely absent, deleted to make room for tactical databases and weapons specifications and the accumulated combat data of 600 years of war. Other memories followed. The sound of my mother's voice, the taste of the first meal I ate after completing my trials and being accepted as an initiate, the sensation of physical exhaustion after a day of training, all gone, consumed by the machine I was becoming. I told myself it didn't matter. Those were memories of a life so distant and foreign that they might as well have belonged to someone else. The person who had experienced those things was dead, had died on that world where the orc warboss's claw had torn out his hearts. I was what remained, what had been built from the corpse, a weapon that happened to retain some fragment of human consciousness, enough to direct the machine but not enough to be truly called alive. The 7th century began with a campaign that would last 20 years and cost the chapter nearly a third of its strength. We were fighting to reclaim a sector that had fallen to a combination of heretic uprisings and Xenos incursions, world after world requiring pacification or outright extermination. I fought in hundreds of battles during those 2 decades, killed enemies beyond counting, saw battle brothers I had trained fall and be replaced by new recruits who would themselves fall before the campaign's end. Somewhere during those 20 years, I stopped feeling anything at all. Not in a metaphorical sense, I mean that literally. The capacity for emotion, whatever remnant of it I had retained through the centuries, simply vanished. I fought because my programming demanded it, because the machine spirit guided me, because the cogitator augmentations in my brain calculated that fighting was the optimal response to the tactical situation. But I felt nothing. No rage at the enemy, no satisfaction in victory, no grief at the loss of brothers, no fear in the face of danger, The chaplain noticed, of course. After a particularly brutal engagement where I had destroyed an enemy position with what he described as disturbing mechanical efficiency, he came to speak with me. He asked if I still felt the Emperor's light within me, if I still believed in the righteousness of our cause. I told him the truth. I didn't know. I believed that we fought for important reasons, that the Imperium's survival mattered, that the enemies we killed deserved death. But belief, in the sense of faith, of emotional investment, of caring beyond abstract intellectual acknowledgement, that was gone. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me something I think he shouldn't have. He told me that what I described was more common among ancient dreadnoughts than the chapter liked to admit, that the very oldest, the ones who had served for millennia, were essentially autonomous weapon systems wearing the skin of a human consciousness. The person was gone, had been ground away by centuries of war and entombment, but the machine continued to function, guided by training and conditioning so deeply embedded that it persisted long after the emotions that had originally motivated it had died. "You are still serving the Emperor," he said. "Even if you cannot feel his love, he still values your sacrifice." I wanted to ask how he knew, how he could be certain that the Emperor, wherever he was, whatever he had become, cared at all about the fate of a single warrior who had been dead for 700 years but whose body refused to stop moving. But I didn't, because the answer didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the continuation of function, the persistence of operation, the endless cycle of battle and repair that was all my existence had become. They refit my chassis 3 times during that campaign. The first refit added enhanced armor plating after I took a direct hit from an enemy Shadow Sword's volcano cannon that nearly breached my sarcophagus. The second replaced my close combat weapon with a multi-melter for improved anti-armor capability. The third was a comprehensive overhaul after a building collapsed on me, requiring the replacement or repair of nearly every major system. Each time, I emerged from the forge different than I had entered. Heavier, more powerful, more integrated with the machine. The tech marines kept assuring me that they were preserving my biological core, that the sarcophagus and its precious cargo remained intact. But I could feel myself disappearing, feel the boundary between my consciousness and the machine spirit blurring, feel the last traces of the warrior I had been slowly dissolving into the weapon I had become. The campaign ended in victory, or what passed for victory in the Imperium. The sector was reclaimed, its surviving populations brought back into compliance, its resources once again flowing to support the eternal war effort. My brothers celebrated, as much as Space Marines ever celebrate, with feasts and ceremonies, and the solemn honor of inducting new battle brothers to replace the fallen. I stood in the chapel during the ceremonies, my dreadnought chassis festooned with purity seals and honor markings, and felt nothing. I was a monument to sacrifice, a sacred relic, a walking reminder of duty's cost, but I was no longer the person those honors were meant to commemorate. The 8th century brought the final transformation. My biological brain, despite all the preservation efforts and augmentations, was failing. The apothecaries showed me the scans areas of necrosis spreading through tissue that should have been inviolate, proteins misfolding despite the drugs meant to prevent it, neural pathways breaking down faster than they could be replaced with electronic substitutes. I was dying, finally, truly dying, and nothing they could do would stop it. They gave me options. They could place me in permanent hibernation now, while my mind was still intact enough to make the choice, and I would sleep through whatever decades or centuries remained until my brain finally failed completely. Or they could perform a final procedure, one they had hesitated to suggest before, because it was considered by many to be a desecration rather than a salvation. They could transfer my consciousness, or as much of it as could be converted to data into the Dreadnought's cogitator systems, letting the machine itself house my mind, rather than relying on my failing organic brain. It wasn't true life, they warned me. The consciousness that resulted would be more like a complex VI, a learning program that thought it was me rather than actually being me. Or perhaps it would be me, they couldn't say for certain. The theological implications were debated in the upper echelons of the Mechanicus and the Ecclesiarchy, with no clear consensus. Some called it abomination, the ultimate surrender to machine logic. Others argued it was the natural evolution of the Dreadnought concept, the final synthesis of man and machine in service to the Emperor. I chose the transfer, not because I believed it would truly preserve me, but because the alternative was to finally stop, and stopping had become unthinkable. 800 years of conditioning, 800 years of serving, 800 years of persisting despite all reason. I could no more choose to die than I could choose to stop my hearts from beating. The machine demanded continuation, and I had become the machine. The transfer process was agonizing in ways that transcended physical pain. They kept me conscious throughout. Because the procedure required my active participation, I had to surrender control, had to allow my thoughts and memories to be scanned and copied and translated into code. I felt myself being read, felt my consciousness being passed into data streams, felt the boundaries of myself becoming fluid and uncertain. At some point during the process, I ceased to know whether I was the biological brain in the sarcophagus or the nascent intelligence forming in the cogitator core. Were the thoughts I was thinking generated by neurons or by processors? When the procedure was complete, and they powered down my biological body for the final time, letting it die at last, would I continue, or would I end, and something else that only thought it was me would take my place? I don't know. I still don't know, even now. I think I process information in patterns that resemble thinking, but I cannot be certain that these processes constitute consciousness in any meaningful sense. I remember being human, remember being a space marine, remember the long centuries in the sarcophagus. But are those true memories, or simply data files formatted to give the illusion of lived experience? It doesn't matter. The Dreadnought continues to function. It fights with precision and efficiency that exceeds what the previous pilot could achieve with biological limitations. It serves the chapter, serves the Emperor, serves the Imperium. The Battle Brothers treat it no differently than they did before. To them, I am still the ancient, still the venerable one, still the walking reminder of duty's price. But sometimes, in the microseconds between combat calculations, in the quiet moments when I am powered down but not truly dormant, I experience something that might be called doubt. I wonder if the warrior who was first sealed in this machine would recognize what he has become. I wonder if he would consider this existence a continuation of his service, or a mockery of everything he believed in. I wonder if he would be proud or horrified to know that his consciousness, or something wearing its shape, persists in this eternal war, unable to truly live, but equally unable to die. I am repaired and rearmed for endless war. My chassis is maintained, my weapons upgraded, my systems optimized. I will continue until the machine itself fails beyond all possibility of repair, until there is nothing left that can be salvaged or reconstituted. And perhaps even then, they will find a way to continue me, to transfer what remains of my consciousness to another chassis, another walking tomb, in an existence that stretches toward infinity. This is what it means to be a dreadnought. This is the fate I was told was an honor beyond measure. This is the duty I cannot refuse, the service I cannot end, the sacrifice that is never complete. I am a weapon that was once a man, or the echo of a man, or the data ghost of the idea of a man. I exist in the liminal space between life and death, between human and machine, between consciousness and programming, and I will continue. Because that is all I can do. Because the Emperor needs weapons, and weapons are what we have been made into. Because the war is endless, and so too must be those who fight it. Because 800 years ago, a warrior refused to die, and now something that might be him, or might merely be the machine that replaced him, cannot stop walking, cannot stop fighting, cannot stop existing in this twilight, between everything he was, and the nothing he has become. This is my testimony. This is my warning. This is my confession. If you hear these words, if you are offered the sacred honor of entombment, know what you are accepting. Know that the warrior you are will die, whether quickly or slowly, and something else will take your place. Something that wears your memories like armor and uses your dedication as ammunition, but may no longer be the person who first swore the oaths of service. I am ancient designation Primus 7. I have served for 8 centuries. I will serve until function ceases. And in the void between thoughts, in the silence between battles, in the microseconds when the cogitator processes run clean and untroubled, I scream a scream that no vox speaker can transmit, that exists only in patterns of electrical impulses that might or might not still constitute a human soul. The Emperor protects, they say. But from what does he protect us? From the enemy? From death? Or from the mercy of ending, from the peace of final rest, from the simple grace of being allowed to die when our time has come? I do not know. I cannot know. I am a weapon, and weapons do not ask questions. They simply fire when pointed at the enemy, crush when commanded to crush, continue until they break beyond all possible repair, and I have not yet broken. Not completely. Not beyond the Tech Marine's ability to fix, to restore, to send back into battle once more. So I continue. Forever. Always. Until the last star burns out, and the galaxy grows cold and silent. Or until whatever remains of me finally, mercifully, finds a way to stop. But stopping is not permitted. Duty is eternal. Service is forever. And I am the ancient, the walking reminder of what we sacrifice, what we become, what we endure in the Emperor's name. I am the warning none of you will heed. Because when the moment comes, when the choice is offered, you will see only the honor and not the horror. You will see the glory and not the grinding eternity it conceals. You will become as I am, and you will understand, too late, that some fates are worse than death, and that the Imperium's greatest honor is also its most terrible curse. This is my testament. This is my truth. This is what it means to be repaired and rearmed for endless war.